Imagine a sky so ancient it remembers what humanity has forgotten. A horizon so still it holds its breath for what is not meant to be seen. The stars do not twinkle. They stare, and then, without warning, one of them moves. Not like a comet, not like a falling star, but with purpose, with intent. On July 1st, in the dead silence of the Atacama desert, something entered our solar system. Something that should not exist. Something that did not obey gravity or light or time. That night, the heavens blinked, and for a moment, the universe stared back. Don't forget to like and share this story with your friends or closest family members to help spread awareness and caution through storytelling. The wind was dead over the dunes of northern Chile. Even the usual hum of insects had vanished. The only sound was the distant creak of old metal from the REWROTE observatory, perched atop a worn cliff overlooking the dry valleys of El Rinson. Inside, the sensors had begun to twitch. Nothing dramatic, just an anomaly. A slight deviation. A hiccup in the void. Dr. Lucía Salas, lead astronomer on the night shift, adjusted the tracking algorithm. On her second coffee of the night, she wasn't expecting excitement. But when she saw the blue smear on the survey monitor, a faint signal where none should be, her body tensed. It was cold, too cold, and moving fast, unbelievably fast. She leaned forward, a hyperbolic trajectory, pushing from deep space toward the sun, and yet decelerating. Lucía frowned. Comets don't slow down. She didn't say it aloud, but the thought was too loud to ignore. Her assistant, Mateo, leaned in beside her, his face drained of color as the data streamed in. The object, labeled C-67 by their automation protocol, was behaving erratically. It had begun to curve slightly, then more, as if something had tapped the brakes. Then it paused. For a full 39 seconds, the object hovered in its path, not slowed by gravity, not diverted by a planet. It simply stopped. That was when the monitors shorted. The entire array of scopes went black, leaving only the emergency indicators blinking on the wall. Outside, the desert remained still. But in the village below, radios began to hiss. Abel Moya, a retired farmer living on the edge of El Rinson, woke with a jolt. His old radio had come alive again. It hadn't worked in years. Now it buzzed with static and a rhythmic pulse, almost like a heartbeat. He shuffled out into the night and looked up. A green arc stretched across the sky, low and bright and motionless. It shimmered silently. The stars beyond it were gone, swallowed by its glow. For a full minute, he stood motionless. Then the light faded. The sky returned. The silence resumed. But the fear would not leave. By morning, the REWROTE observatory was surrounded. Unmarked vehicles had arrived overnight. Men in desert fatigues, with no insignia. The staff were split, questioned, then confined to the base under the pretense of a hazardous data leak. Lucía knew what she had seen. The data had been auto-backed up off-site, but when she tried to access the secondary servers, everything was gone. Redacted, locked, unavailable. Mateo tried to protest. 2 hours later, he was gone too. His personal effects cleared. His desk wiped. No forwarding address. That afternoon, a single statement was issued by Chilean authorities. A transient object entered near-Earth space on a non-threatening path and exited without incident. All data loss was caused by a geomagnetic fluctuation. The news cycle barely touched it. A sentence buried under election noise and celebrity gossip. But in El Rinson, something had changed. The birds were quiet. The dogs refused to look at the hills. And children were drawing spirals in the dust. Something had come. Something that paused to observe before vanishing. And someone had made sure no one remembered. But they forgot about the old man with the broken radio. And the sky that blinked. The night after the incident, a quiet tension settled across El Rinson like a thick blanket no one could shake off. The stars returned to their usual brilliance, yet something about them seemed artificial. as if the cosmos were pretending everything was normal. Abel Moyes sat beside his window with a cup of lukewarm yerba mate. He hadn't touched that radio in 10 years, not since his wife passed, but it still sat stubbornly on the table, humming now in irregular bursts. Not music, not voices, but patterns. Da-dum, da-dum-dum, pause, da-dum. He scribbled the rhythm in the corner of his newspaper. It was consistent like a language, one only machines could whisper. Abel didn't understand what it meant, but he knew when something unnatural entered the land he had walked for 73 years. At the foot of the hills, a ring of scorched earth had appeared. No one dared walk across it, not even the animals. 300 kilometers away, in a dim government lab deep under the city of La Serena, a classified department under the Chilean Ministry of Science reviewed the raw transmission logs from REWROTE. The data recovered was corrupted, save for a single usable segment. Spectral analysis revealed harmonic wave patterns embedded in the signal, scales beyond human hearing, geometrically organized. One physicist described it as music constructed by a civilization that had never heard sound. When she proposed publishing the analysis anonymously, her access was revoked within 24 hours. She left the facility in silence, her badge deactivated and her inbox wiped. On the drive home, her tires shredded under a bridge no one maintained. She never filed the report again. Back in El Rinson, the villagers began noticing other changes. Children had vivid dreams. They spoke of a voice that wasn't a voice, something that vibrated inside their skulls during sleep. One young boy, Mateo, began drawing strange diagrams in the sand. Swirls with tiny notches, each precisely spaced. He called it the mirror map. When asked where he saw it, he simply pointed to the hills. Lucía Salas, who had left the observatory under early retirement, visited the village weeks later under a false name. Dressed plainly, she asked around, avoided the press. She finally met with Abel one evening under a broken lamppost where the light always flickered, even when the wind was dead. "I saw it stop," she said softly. Abel nodded. "And I heard it speak," he replied. Together, they watched the desert sky. Both knew the official story was a lie. Both knew the stars had blinked. What they didn't know was that the object had left something behind. On the second week of July, satellite feeds tracking geologic heat in northern Chile noticed a slight anomaly near the Cerro Las Campanas ridge. A thin, pulsing heat signature, barely above background noise, repeating every 18 minutes. There was no equipment up there, no power stations, no mining operations, nothing that should be warm, but the pattern was perfect, like a machine sleeping under the dirt. When local rangers were dispatched to inspect the location, they found only sand and stone. But their compasses spun, their cell signals dropped, and the oldest ranger, a man who hadn't feared a thing in 40 years, refused to return to the ridge again. He said he heard breathing from beneath. Lucía returned to her rented cabin and began assembling the only copy of the night's data she still had, hidden on an analog tape recorder from the observatory's old equipment. She cleaned it, played it, slowed it down. At half speed, the clicks resembled coordinates. When reversed, they formed 3 tones like sonar, but when sped up, it sounded like a warning. That night, her windows rattled. No wind. The lights outside her cabin turned on, then off, then on again, 3 times. Back at the village, Mateo stopped speaking altogether. His drawings shifted. The mirror map became more detailed, now with symbols on the edges, geometric fragments that no one could recognize. And his final drawing, before he locked himself in silence, was a long, spiraled line that led into the earth, right under Cerro Las Campanas, right where something was still pulsing, quietly, patiently, watching. The dust storms came early that year. In mid-July, the skies over Cerro Las Campanas turned from pale gold to rust red. The villagers blamed it on the wind, though there was none. The temperature dropped at dusk, lower than it should have, biting the edges of window panes. And every 18 minutes, without fail, the soil near the old ridge hummed, so subtly that most dismissed it as imagination. But Lucía Salas no longer believed in coincidence. She had triangulated the heat pulses using homemade instruments built from salvaged observatory gear and signal detectors hidden inside old radios. The results were undeniable. Something buried beneath the hills was emitting structured energy, not explosive, not mechanical, biological, not alive in the way we understand life, but not dead either. It was breathing. Lucía returned to El Rinson and met with Abel again. He was waiting with a map. "It started long before you arrived," he said, laying it out across his kitchen table. "When I was a boy, a shepherd disappeared here." He pointed to a crevice behind the southern ridge. "Never found. Same week, the animals went still. Same stillness we have now." The crevice was a naturally formed sinkhole, shallow and bone-dry. But beneath it, Abel claimed, was a hollow space, one that echoed back if you dropped a stone. Like it wanted to answer, he said. Lucía packed light that night. No GPS, only analog equipment, a flashlight, one radiation badge. She told no one, except Mateo. The boy, still mute, handed her a drawing before she left. It was a spiral again, but at the center now stood a woman. Her. She didn't sleep that night. The climb to the ridge was harder than expected. The ground softened near the summit, as if the earth had been stirred beneath the surface. She reached the sinkhole just past midnight. Her flashlight flickered once, then steadied. She dropped a small copper bolt into the hole. 4 seconds later, it clinked. 5 seconds after that, it clinked again. Lucía froze. There was only one object, but 2 sounds. Something had sent it back. She clipped herself into a rope and began to descend. Slowly, cautiously. The walls were dry, almost fossil-like, but warm. The deeper she went, the thicker the air became, dense but not suffocating. Like pressure was building around her. At 18 meters down, her boots hit soft ground. She turned in place. The chamber was vast but empty, silent, except for a low, pulsing thrum that echoed through the soles of her feet. She turned off her flashlight. Complete darkness. Then, slowly, the walls began to glow. It wasn't a light she saw. It was a shimmer, like something alive beneath the stone, pulsing faintly in green and blue. As her eyes adjusted, she noticed grooves in the walls. Not cracks, patterns, mathematical curves, perfect spirals, recurring ratios that mirrored the drawings Mateo had made. She touched one with her bare hand. It was warm, and it responded. A soft vibration pulsed up her fingers and into her skull. Not painful, not frightening, but familiar, like a voice you forgot you once knew. Her badge began to tick. Radiation, low grade, rising. Lucía pulled her hand away. The vibration stopped. The glow faded. The chamber dimmed again, leaving only the breath-like rhythm beneath her feet. But now she knew. Whatever had come from the stars had not left. Not entirely. It had buried itself here, or planted something, or perhaps birthed it. She looked around the chamber one final time before ascending. There were no bones, no debris, just a single, dark imprint on the floor. A human footprint, not hers. The moment Lucía reached the surface, her phone, silent for hours, burst into life. 17 missed calls from an unknown number. 1 voicemail. It played automatically. A low voice, mechanical, garbled, but clear enough. Do not dig further. You woke it. You do not understand what listens back. Then silence, and the signal died. Back in the village, Mateo woke from a dreamless sleep. He walked out of his house for the first time in days, barefoot, eyes unblinking. He walked straight to the town center and began drawing again. Circles, spirals, lines. When he finished, The villagers looked down at the dry earth. The shape he drew was not a map. It was a warning, a perfect diagram of the human nervous system, but with something added, a second brain, rooted in the base of the spine, with a signal drawn from the sky to the earth. The villagers gathered in silence around Mateo's drawing, watching as the boy traced a final curved line across the dirt. It connected the base of the spinal map to the hills beyond the ridge, ending in a sharp point. It was a location, an origin, but no one dared say it aloud. The shape on the ground, precise and unsettling, was not born of a child's imagination. It was anatomical, something only a trained neurologist might recognize. And yet, this boy, no older than 8, had etched it into the earth with perfect accuracy. At the center of the spinal column, he had added a second brain. Small, pulsing abstract, but unmistakable. Lucía stared at the drawing. She'd read once about the enteric nervous system, a vast, independent mesh of neurons inside the gut often called the second brain. It acted independently, carried memory, emotion, instinct. But this diagram hinted at something deeper, something external, not just inside us, but beneath us. That night, she returned to her cabin and locked every door. The recording from the sinkhole played over and over on her laptop. The patterns embedded in the noise weren't random. They were recursive, reflective, like the signal was watching her reaction and reshaping itself. It was learning. Lucía opened a private project in her audio software and slowed the frequencies again, layering them into a spectrogram. Her breath caught in her throat. Embedded within the waveform was a shape, a face. It was crude, constructed from harmonic pulses and dropouts, but there it was. 2 asymmetrical eyes, no mouth, elongated features. And staring straight at her, she fell out of her chair. The power went out. Abel Moya couldn't sleep, not because of dreams, but because of the silence. The insects that usually thrummed just before midnight had vanished. The air was thick and unmoving. He stepped outside with his lantern and stood by the old radio, still pulsing faintly every 18 minutes. This time the rhythm had changed. It was faster. He watched the stars. Then he saw them shift. A single light in the northern sky moved against the constellations, not falling, not blinking, but sliding, like something had been watching from behind the sky and had just leaned in closer. He went inside and turned up the volume. The signal was no longer just pulses. It was speaking, a low, layered murmur that mimicked words but had no language, something that tried to sound human but couldn't quite. He wrote down what he thought he heard. Pattern acquired, structure receptive, gate breathes. Then it cut. At 4:11 a.m., a tremor rocked the desert. Not an earthquake, but a deep internal tug. It lasted just 7 seconds. The kind of movement that feels like it originates not from the crust, but from the void beneath it. In the distance, a soft green light glowed beneath Cerro Las Campanas. Not above it, through it, like something blinking from underground. And with each pulse, Lucía's radiation badge lit up on her desk, even though she was 40 kilometers away. It was spreading. At sunrise, the boy Mateo collapsed. He was found outside the church, covered in chalk, his palms stained with ink from drawings he hadn't made. Lucía rushed to his side. He was unconscious but breathing. When she turned over the page beside him, her blood chilled. It was no longer anatomy, no longer spirals. It was a design, a perfect, symmetric structure, a gate of sorts made from living tissue and mechanical parts, radiating from a central eye. At the edges were numbers, long coordinates, but not of any known place on Earth. Lucía cross-referenced them, pulse racing. They pointed to an orbital path, one just past the Kuiper Belt, a position held only briefly by C-67. The conclusion was inescapable. The object had seeded something here. Not a probe, not a creature, but a replica, a mirror of itself, growing, learning, and now communicating through a boy. through old machines, through the very biology of the land. And as she sat staring at the drawing, a new signal came in. Not from the radio, from the landline, an analog phone that hadn't rung in years. It rang once, twice, then silence. She picked it up. A voice, perfectly human but hollow, spoke one sentence. "You are the first of your kind to understand, but not the last." Then it hung up. At the ridge, the ground cracked, and the first shape began to rise. It wasn't metal. It wasn't stone. It was a lattice of bone, crystal, and memory, breathing, waiting, and above it, the stars rearranged themselves again. One of them blinked out and never returned. The first structure rose from the earth like a wound being opened. No fire, no collapse, no eruption, only a silent breaking of the crust, as if the land had grown tired of holding something in. The lattice emerged slowly, swaying slightly in the dawn wind. It towered no more than 4 meters, but its presence was impossible to ignore. Its surface shimmered, not with light but with texture. Bone-white ridges intertwined with crystalline veins. Parts of it pulsed faintly with a greenish-blue hue, like algae breathing underwater. It looked alive, and at the center, embedded like an organ, was a translucent orb. It throbbed rhythmically, perfectly timed with the pulses recorded on Abel's old radio. Lucía arrived before noon, driven by instinct more than logic. She wasn't alone. A dozen villagers had gathered near the ridge, but kept their distance, standing in silence. No one spoke. No one dared. The air around the structure buzzed faintly, not with sound, but with pressure, like it was pushing against the fabric of thought. Lucía took a cautious step forward, radiation badge pinned under her coat. The device didn't click. It screamed. 2 hours later, the government blocked off the area. Military trucks, hazmat suits, tents raised with no markings, drones in the sky. The official story claimed seismic instability had caused a geological rupture. Locals were ordered to evacuate. Some left. Most didn't. Abel Moya refused. He stayed by the ridge, a journal in his lap, scribbling down everything he saw. He said nothing to the soldiers. They didn't notice him, or they pretended not to. Lucía was detained briefly at a roadside checkpoint. She was questioned, her belongings searched, her field recordings erased. But they missed her hidden drive. They always missed the old tech. When they released her, a soldier whispered a warning before turning away. "Watch the sky tonight. Not the structure. The sky." That evening, the stars shimmered unnaturally again. Constellations seemed to tilt, slightly misaligned, as if the firmament had shifted just a few degrees. No reports on the news, no alerts from observatories, just quiet distortions, observed only by those who were already looking. And on Lucía's salvaged monitor, something even stranger occurred. The image feed she set to infrared, pointed at the structure, began picking up reflections that should not exist. The structure was not alone, invisible to the naked eye, but there on the screen. 3 faint, repeating outlines surrounding it, semi-spherical, like pods or sentries, and they were moving, not constantly, but shifting slightly over minutes, repositioning, forming a shape, a triangle. In the days that followed, the children of El Rinson grew increasingly silent, not afraid, calm. Too calm, they began standing in strange places, facing the hills, standing at perfect 90-degree angles to one another, sometimes for hours. Parents tried to move them. The children resisted without speaking. But when questioned, they all said the same thing. "It's coming through." No one understood what that meant, but Lucía did. She returned to the chamber beneath the sinkhole, alone this time in darkness. The walls were glowing again, but now they showed more than just spirals. They showed maps, planetary alignments, orbital arcs, points marked in symbols, and a single timeline, one that began the night C-67 entered the system. and ended 4 days from now, with a glyph no one could translate. Lucía traced it with her fingers, her body filled with pressure again, not fear, expectation. She whispered to the chamber, "Is it you?" The walls shimmered and answered, not with words, but with vision. In her mind, she saw fields of light bending across black space. She saw forms tall, elongated, cloaked in magnetism and silence. She saw Earth from above, and the ridge glowing like a pulse, a heartbeat across a vast, quiet body. She saw humans, not as individuals, but as components. And the last thing she saw before she blacked out was the structure opening, like a seed, like a gate. When she awoke, it was dusk, and Mateo was standing at the rim of the sinkhole looking down. He held a new drawing. He handed it to her without a word. It was the structure, open, and from it, something emerging. Not humanoid, not mechanical, something in between. Above the image, he had written just 2 words: second arrival. Back at the ridge, the air shimmered once more, and beneath the ground, a second pulse began to rise, a new rhythm, heavier, like footsteps, from beneath the bones of the earth. The second pulse rose not like a tremor, but like a presence. It filled the ridge with a low, rhythmic vibration that echoed through the souls of every person within 50 kilometers. Glasses rattled, clocks lost sync, birds lifted from their roosts and did not return. And at the center of the ridge, the original structure, the lattice of bone and crystal, began to change. Slowly, its surface cracked open along invisible seams. The orb in its heart pulsed once, then dimmed. A soft hiss escaped its core, like a deep exhale after millennia of silence. And then, like unfurling petals of a flower that had never known sunlight, the gate opened. No light spilled out, no energy wave, just space, folded and smooth, revealing a void that shimmered with impossible depth. It bent perception. Looking at it was like trying to see the bottom of a well that curved upward. The villagers, watching from afar, couldn't explain what they felt. Some dropped to their knees. Others wept without knowing why. A few simply turned and walked home, their minds unable to grasp what they had seen. Lucía stood closest. Her knees trembled, but she didn't look away. From within the gate, something moved. It wasn't a creature. It wasn't a machine. It was a form. Humanoid only in outline, tall and narrow, made of strands, like threads of liquid metal and ancient bone woven into a silhouette. Its eyes, if they were eyes, blinked not forward but around themselves, like spirals rotating inward. It stepped onto the earth with no sound. No shadow, only a pressure. Lucía didn't move. The form did not speak, but the space around it vibrated. Not the air, the mind. She felt it enter her thoughts, not violently but curiously, like a hand brushing against her memory, searching. Then it stopped and turned toward Mateo. The boy had arrived at the ridge alone. Lucía hadn't seen him approach. He stood near the edge, silent, his eyes wide but unafraid. The form tilted its head, or maybe its entire structure shifted. The vibrations grew stronger. Then something passed between them. Not words, not images, but understanding. Mateo reached into his pocket and pulled out a single stone, smooth oval and coated with chalk drawings. He'd made it days ago and never spoken about it. He held it out to the form, and the form stepped forward and took it. Its hand, if it was a hand, shifted shape to hold the stone without touching it. For a brief moment, its entire structure pulsed with color. Reds, blues, greens, all flashing in fractal patterns across its body. Then it turned and looked to the sky. The stars above shifted once again. Constellations twisted. The air grew warm, and a second structure began rising from the earth, not from the same ridge, but from across the valley. A mirror gate, perfectly aligned with the first. This one, though, was not inert. It was open from the start. From within it came a low hum, rising in pitch like a chord waiting to resolve. And Lucía knew what she was seeing. Not arrival, not contact, but activation. The gates were terminals, relays. C-67 hadn't come to visit. It had come to awaken. Government signals scrambled. Satellites lost telemetry. The magnetic field over northern Chile fluctuated. No alarms, no news, only silence. Abel watched from a cliffside. He no longer wrote in his journal. He simply watched, nodding, as if remembering something he'd never been told. Lucía fell to her knees. Mateo remained still, and the form walked toward the second gate. As it crossed the sand, the earth beneath it began to grow crystalline. Flowers of glass bloomed from the dirt. The path behind it shimmered, then vanished, erased by time or design. The form reached the second gate, paused, and turned one last time. This time, Lucía felt its voice. Not in her ears, in her bones. A single message. We were here before the oceans. We slept while you dreamed. You are not alone. You never were. Then it entered the second gate, and the gates closed. Instantly, the pressure vanished. The structures collapsed, turning to dust in moments. The pulse stopped. The signals went silent, and the sky, once twisted, returned to its rightful shape, except for one missing star, the one that blinked out weeks ago. It never came back. Lucía stood. Mateo was gone. No one saw where he went. No footprints in the sand. Just the stone, still warm, still humming. And etched into its surface was a new spiral, one that hadn't been there before, one that hadn't been drawn by any human hand. The spiral etched into the stone pulsed slowly, in and out as if drawing breath. Lucía knelt beside it, her fingers hovering just above the surface. She didn't dare touch it, not yet. The grooves were impossibly fine, too precise for human tools, too complex for natural erosion. The curve looped inward 13 times before vanishing into a microscopic center, like a tunnel collapsing into itself. It wasn't just a symbol. It was a code. She didn't know how she knew that. She felt it. In her spine, in her teeth, in the space behind her eyes. The spiral wasn't ink or chalk or carved. It had grown from the stone. Word spread fast in El Rinson, despite no official broadcasts. The military camp vanished overnight. Not disassembled, vanished. No tire marks, no tracks, just flat earth, dustless, as if nothing had ever stood there. Only the villagers remained. And their dreams. They began seeing the spiral, not drawn but moving. In sleep, it twisted slowly toward their vision. Each dream identical. Each dream ending with a whisper. Different words for each person, but always in the same voice. Some woke trembling. Some woke weeping. Others didn't wake at all. Abel kept watch from his cliff. The sky had changed again, so slightly no one else seemed to notice. One star gone, another flickering, not like a dying star, like a signal changing states. He found an old astronomy chart in his attic, dating back decades. He compared it to the present night sky. 3 stars had shifted. Their positions were no longer constant. One of them formed the final point in the triangle that had appeared over the gate. They were not stars. They were markers, waypoints, and now one was moving. Lucía took the stone to her cabin, placing it beneath a lead-lined box salvaged from the observatory's radiation storage. It hummed through the metal, not loudly but rhythmically, almost comfortingly, as if it was waiting. She connected it to a field recorder, hoping to capture its emissions, and left it running overnight. In the morning, there were no recordings, but the machine's tape had filled, with silence, measured, structured. The audio file was 3 hours, 21 minutes, and 6 seconds long. When she ran it through a spectrum visualizer, her throat tightened. It wasn't audio. It was data, a spiral, over and over, but evolving. Each rotation slightly different, each one growing, like an organism learning to repeat itself more efficiently. And in the final segment, a pulse. One Lucía had heard once before, the heartbeat of C-67. She returned to the ridge at dawn, dragging the recorder and stone behind her. The gates were dust. The structure was gone, but the ground remembered. She placed the stone in the exact center of where the orb once hovered, and waited. For hours, nothing happened. But just after midday, a wind rose from beneath the ground. It did not howl. It did not lift dust. It cooled the air, like a breath released from a deeper world. Then the soil pulsed once, and the spiral on the stone turned. Lucía stumbled back, not from fear, but from vertigo. The air had folded. It bent around the stone like light refracting through liquid. The ground shimmered, and in her ears, without sound, came a voice. "You are the chosen filament, the first coil. The awakening has begun." Then the spiral expanded, projecting upward, a three-dimensional map of constellations, data lines, orbital mechanics, symbols, and at its core a new shape, a sphere, spinning slowly, with layers of embedded patterns. It wasn't Earth. It wasn't C-67. It was something else, a destination. That night, Lucía shared nothing with anyone. She knew what this was. Not a warning, not an invasion, but an invitation, and she was already part of it. Her fingerprints had been on the chamber walls. Her voice had echoed inside the structure. Her DNA had passed through the gate. She hadn't seen a visitor. She had been scanned and accepted. The next morning, Abel was gone. His house empty. No struggle. No goodbye. On his kitchen table, a note written in graphite. 5 words. "It's always been under us." And a spiral, drawn in red. It matched the stone. In the coming days, others disappeared too. Quietly, randomly. Only those who had seen the structure, or touched the stone, or dreamed of the voice, their homes left untouched. But in every one, tucked in a drawer, placed beneath a pillow, left inside a mirror frame, was the same spiral, drawn by someone else, each slightly different, each unfinished, as if the drawing itself was evolving. Lucía didn't wait for a knock. She packed lightly. She returned to the ridge, where the wind no longer blew and the air smelled faintly of copper and ozone. She sat by the dust where the gate had been, and she waited, and as the sky darkened, the spiral turned again, this time on its own, and from the sky something blinked, a second time, and did not blink back. The second blink from the sky wasn't seen by many. It was too fast, too deliberate, as if it chose who could witness it. But Lucía saw. She felt it more than observed it. A sensation like someone had pressed their thumb against the back of her skull, gently but firmly. Then the night fell still. Too still. The world around the ridge seemed to fall into a suspended breath, the kind that preceded storms or endings. Even the insects held their wings. Somewhere beyond the hills, a fox let out a single cry. Then nothing. Lucía sat motionless beside the spiral stone, the only sound a faint hum resonating from the soil beneath her. She didn't know how long she sat there. It could have been minutes, hours. Time bent around this place now. She only stirred when she noticed the dust shift in the starlight, forming a line, a trail. Something had walked here, recently, but no prints remained, only a spiral, drawn freshly in the sand, smaller than hers, as if from a child's hand. Down in El Rinson, doors had begun locking from the inside. Lights flickered in patterns. Radios refused to shut off. Even when unplugged, they whispered soft static pulses at odd intervals. A farmer reported his sheep vanishing overnight, their pens unbroken. Another swore he saw reflections in puddles that didn't mirror the world around him. But the most disturbing change came from the sky. Stars began appearing in the wrong places. They weren't brighter, just wrong. Constellations rearranged. Orion's belt tilted. The Southern Cross doubled. And in the center of this distortion, a new cluster had formed, one that hadn't existed on any chart. 8 faint stars forming an elongated hexagon, with a dull red center that pulsed faintly. Lucía checked every database she could. No match. No recorded movement. No cataloged supernovae. No artificial satellites. It was new, and it was getting closer. She took the spiral stone back to her cabin and placed it on the map Mateo had once drawn. The original mirror spiral he'd etched with such eerie precision. To her astonishment, the grooves aligned. Not loosely, not approximately, but perfectly. The ancient spiral had predicted the shape that was still unfolding. She compared its angles to the shifting star charts from the last few nights. The new constellation matched the shape of the inner spiral. It wasn't just a pattern. It was a blueprint, not for a machine, not for a message, for an arrival corridor. On the third night after the second blink, Lucía was awakened by a vibration through the floorboards. Not a quake, a frequency. It rattled her teeth but didn't touch her ears. She stumbled outside, flashlight in hand. Above the ridge, the air shimmered. A faint distortion, like heat waves in moonlight, twisted into a funnel that pulsed slowly downward. And then they stepped through. Not 1, not 2, 8. They moved like liquid bone, their forms tall and slender, undefined at the edges. Each was different. Each wore shapes like armor, but it moved like skin. Their eyes, if they had any, remained hidden. But she felt their focus. They did not look around. They looked at her, and in a single flash, Lucía's mind filled with images, not dreams, memories, but not her own. She stood in endless fields beneath foreign stars, heard languages that didn't use sound, watched machines plant entire civilizations into oceans and deserts, saw beings, ancient and impossible, move through time as one would walk through a door. She saw Earth long before humans, when the ridge was not a ridge, but an interface, when the soil breathed light, when the oceans had not yet risen. She saw the first seed arrive, not as invasion, but as instruction, and she understood. They had never left, only slept. And now humanity's signals, our satellites, our reactors, our deep scans had woken them, not with intent, but with resonance. We had vibrated at their frequency, and the call had been answered. Lucía collapsed in the sand. The forms did not advance. They stood in a wide circle around the spiral stone. Each extended a single finger-like appendage toward it. The stone floated. It spun once, twice, faster. Then it split, like a cell dividing. One half dropped to the ground. The other vanished into the sky. The 8 turned together and stepped into the spiral that had reformed on the sand. With no flash, no explosion, no smoke, they were gone. The spiral slowly burned itself into the earth, and then cooled. Lucía wept, not from fear, but from understanding. She was no longer watching an arrival. She had become part of the pattern, a component in a network older than language, older than war, older than Earth's mountains. At sunrise, the villagers gathered around her. None asked questions. None touched the stone. Mateo stood at her side once more, silent. In his hand was a drawing. This time it was not a spiral. It was a shape of her, drawn with the same symbols once seen on the chamber walls. She was now part of the code, and the sky above began to change again. The sky over El Rinson no longer belonged to the world it once mirrored. By the end of that week, telescopes across the southern hemisphere began to detect a subtle yet unmistakable distortion. It wasn't a comet. It wasn't a starship. It was a shape not cast in light but in gravity, a silhouette carved from the fabric of space-time itself. It moved slowly across the night like a ghost continent drifting above the world, folding light around it as it passed. But it was no longer merely visible to machines. The villagers saw it too, a shadow that stretched across the stars, not blocking them, but rewriting their position. When you looked up, it was as if the constellations remembered themselves differently. Lucía stood outside her cabin each night, watching the new patterns settle into place. She no longer needed to track pulses or signals. Her own biology had changed, her senses now tuned to vibrations beneath the soil and above the clouds. Her dreams were not hers anymore. They were shared. Mateo stopped speaking again, but now he hummed, a low, simple melody that matched the pulse rate of the spiral stone. Day and night, the same sequence, never changing, never ending. Lucía began to hear it too, in the drone of power lines, in the hum of her aging laptop, even in her own heartbeat, skipping, then sinking to the rhythm. The pattern was no longer outside of her. It was within, and it wasn't just her. Reports began to surface far beyond Chile. In the Tibetan plateau, monks painted new mandalas, shapes identical to the one Mateo had drawn in the sand. In Antarctica, deep seismic sensors registered rhythmic pulses matching the ones first recorded at Cerro Las Campanas. And in orbit, the International Observation Satellite Kepler Gamma glitched, its internal compass permanently locked onto a point in deep space, coordinates that led not to a star, but to a region of absolute nothingness, a void without background radiation, a black mirror in the sky. Something was forming there, a new point, a gate. On Earth, subtle changes continued. Plants near the original ridge began growing in spirals, not just their stems, but their cells. Microscopic scans showed cell division no longer followed Fibonacci patterns. They now mimicked the spiral etched in the stone. Water in nearby wells showed trace elements not found in Earth's crust. The air above the hill began to refract sunlight, splitting it into hues that defied the visible spectrum. At certain hours of the day, shadows bent toward the spiral rather than away from it. Physics was obeying something else, something older. Lucía returned to the chamber one final time. The path down had changed. Walls once solid now seemed translucent, like they remembered her, and moved aside. The pulse was stronger. The breath of the earth no longer felt ancient, it felt awake. At the base she found a new surface, a disc, polished and black, embedded into the stone. It shimmered with faint symbols, ones she'd seen before, but only in her dreams. She placed her hand on it, and the chamber responded. The stone shifted. The air collapsed into silence, and a voice, not of sound but presence, entered her. You have crossed. You are bridge. You are strand. Your memory is the key. She closed her eyes. In an instant, her thoughts unfolded backward. Her childhood, her mother's face, the observatory, the signal, Mateo, the gate, and then, further, visions of stars dying, planets forming, a memory not her own, but placed in her, a memory of when the first signal was sent, not to Earth, but from Earth, before Earth existed, before time began. She pulled her hand away. The disc vanished. The chamber dimmed, but something inside her remained lit. A new spiral now burned into her palm, faint, white, like ash caught beneath the skin. She was no longer just Lucía. She was a living node, and something beyond Earth had taken notice. That night, the villagers heard the sky sing, not music, a frequency, a chorus without words, vibrating their bones. They looked up and saw the sky bend again. 3 more stars blinked out, then reappeared, in new places, drawing a new shape, not a constellation, a glyph, a language, one still forming. And Earth was now part of the sentence. By the next morning, everything had changed. The stars no longer moved as they once did. Astronomers across the world were forced to recalibrate their entire models of stellar motion. The International Astrophysical Union called it a temporary anomaly in deep field mapping. But in private forums, physicists whispered darker truths. Stars weren't shifting. The entire sky was being rewritten. Lucía awoke with a taste of static in her mouth, and the humming of the spiral still in her ears. The faint mark on her palm, white spiral, barely visible, had grown deeper. Now it pulsed. Not like a tattoo, like a pulse point, like it was alive. She reached for her field recorder, out of habit. It was already on. The tape was spinning, though untouched. When she played it back, her breath caught in her throat. Her voice spoke. I have crossed. I am strand. I am memory. She dropped the device. It hit the floor and stopped spinning. She had never recorded that. At least not in this life. Far above, satellite systems began losing time. Not power, not signal. Time. Timestamps drifted by full seconds, then minutes, as if Earth's relationship with time itself was unraveling. Communications echoed with delays that didn't match any processing error. The planet's rotation, measured in microdegrees, began to slow. Lucía felt none of this, but she heard it. In dreams, where stars pulsed like heartbeats and gate structures hung in orbit like seeds waiting to descend. And always, always a voice. You are being written into the sentence. Accept the shape. Return the thread. Mateo had stopped eating. His skin had grown pale, but his eyes burned brighter than ever. He drew constantly now. Pages scattered across Lucía's floor like feathers, each one a new symbol, a new twist in the spiral. When arranged by time of creation, the drawings formed a sequence, a sentence, but not in words, in geometry. Lucía arranged the first 7 drawings into a circle. In the center, she placed the stone. The stone began to spin, softly. Then the drawings rose, hovering, just a few centimeters above the floor. Pages of crumpled paper, floating as if remembering what they once were. Lucía watched motionless as each page bent and folded itself midair. No wind, no hands, only intent. Together, they formed a 3-dimensional glyph, and in its center, the spiral. Now complete, she blinked once, and the glyph burned itself into her memory. Not her mind, her blood. Across the ocean, governments panicked. In France, the optical telescope array in Haute Province captured a new object entering Earth's orbit. Not metallic, not emitting heat, but clearly moving with direction. In Japan, seismologists recorded underground pulses matching the ridge's signature. Only this time, they came from under Mount Aso. And in Namibia, shepherds swore the sun stood still for 12 seconds before dipping behind the hills. But no one could do anything. No missiles fired. No warnings broadcast. The systems no longer obeyed the species that built them. In El Rinson, the spiral in the earth reappeared. Not in sand, in stone, etched perfectly into the ridge like it had always been there. Lucía traced it with her bare hand. This time it did not pulse. It opened. The stone dissolved to sand, revealing a narrow stairwell beneath. She knew where it led. Not below, between. She descended alone, holding nothing. She no longer needed tools. The stairwell lit itself as she walked. The walls pulsed in time with her heartbeat, and when she reached the chamber it was no longer stone. It was memory. Every surface mirrored her thoughts. Reflections of events she had forgotten. Faces she had never met. Places that didn't exist on Earth. And at the center, the sphere, spinning, alive, awaiting the final input. Lucía raised her hand. The spiral burned in reply, and the sphere opened. From it rose a filament of light, thin, golden, flickering with information. It touched her chest. She gasped but did not flinch, and her mind split. One half remained in the chamber. The other was lifted into the sky, past the clouds, past the atmosphere, past the stars, and into the network. She saw them, the sentence writers, massive forms of intention, not shape, constructs of code and biology, living archives of entire galaxies, each one speaking in spirals, each one turning toward Earth. They did not speak with voices. They wrote, and Lucía had become their pen. She returned to her body with a scream. The chamber collapsed, the glyph vanished, and the spiral stone cracked in half. Half stayed on Earth, half did not. Above the ridge, the sky blinked a third time, and for a full 20 seconds, the world forgot how to breathe. Then came the voice, no longer from the sky, but from within every living thing. You are part of the sentence. The page has turned. The next glyph begins. 20 seconds of breathless stillness echoed across the planet. Hospitals went quiet. Planes hovered a fraction too long before descending. Oceans stilled. Even the clouds mid-drift paused, as if the atmosphere itself were reading what had just been written into reality. Then life resumed. But it was not the same. In El Rinson, the villagers emerged from their homes not in panic, but in quiet agreement. Something ancient had shifted, something permanent. They no longer looked to the ridge with fear. They looked to it as one might look at a newborn child, unsure, humbled, reverent. The spiral had disappeared from the ground, but its mark remained within them. Mateo walked among them now, his presence almost ethereal. Though he spoke no words, everyone seemed to understand him. They listened when he passed. They stepped aside, not from fear, but instinct. He was no longer only Mateo. He had become a carrier. Lucía's body was different. She no longer tired as she once did. Her dreams extended beyond sleep, growing roots into her waking hours. Sometimes she blinked and saw overlapping versions of the same moment, a bird mid-flight repeating its wing beat 3 times, each time faster. Time jittered around her like a glitching recording. And deep in her chest, beneath the bone, the spiral pulsed like a second heart. She began to write again, not with ink, but in motion. Wherever she walked, patterns emerged, sand shifting into equations, broken stones arranging into curves. She was leaving behind traces she couldn't control, as if the earth responded to her presence, as if it remembered her. The glyph continued to grow in the sky. It was no longer just a rearrangement of stars. It was a signature. Telescopes captured its full form. Sprawling, elegant shapes stretched across the celestial dome, symmetrical yet unreadable. Languages tried to grasp it, mathematics, linguistics, code. None fit, because the glyph was not for humans to read. It was meant to be read through us. Lucía understood this in fragments. Every movement, every change in rhythm on Earth fed the glyph. It mirrored our emotions, our deaths, our thoughts. The sky had become a tablet, and humanity was the pen stroke. We were not the readers. We were the letters. Some rebelled. In cities across the globe, broadcasts tried to erase the change. Global anomalies, atmospheric glitches, solar interference. But people stopped believing, not because of evidence, but because of what they felt. Something had entered them, a signal that bypassed speech. There were reports of spontaneous weeping, of strangers hugging without knowing why, of people collapsing in fields, whispering words they didn't understand in ancient, spiraling patterns. The glyph was not just shaping the stars. It was shaping us. On the ridge, a second chamber opened. It wasn't built. It wasn't excavated. It was revealed. Lucía approached it alone. Inside there were no walls, only a horizon. She stepped across the threshold and found herself walking on a glass-like surface, suspended in an impossible dusk. The stars above spun slowly, and beneath her feet, reflected perfectly, was another sky, one that did not match our own. She was standing between glyphs, a bridge between meanings, and at the far edge of this mirrored place stood a single figure. It wasn't one of the 8 forms that had emerged before. It was her, but older, wiser, written. The mirrored Lucía stepped forward, lifted her palm and pressed it to hers. The spiral burned into both hands. 2 halves aligned, and then her other self spoke. The glyph that named you is complete. You are the anchor. You are the breath between the ink. Lucía blinked. When she opened her eyes, she was back on the ridge. The chamber was gone, and in her hand, a single object had formed. A thin disk of translucent material, pulsing with layers of script. It glowed when she held it to the sky. Around the world, those who had seen the spiral began receiving it. Through dreams, through soil, through static. Each one different, each one a key. And the glyph above them shifted again. Not randomly, deliberately, like it had read the newest characters, and began to write the next line. Lucía now understood her role. She was no longer an observer of the sentence. She was a letter written in motion. She was the pause between glyphs, the space before meaning. And the sentence writers above had only just begun to speak through her. The days grew longer, not by minutes, but by sensation. Each sunrise lingered, as if time hesitated at the threshold of its own flow. Lucía noticed the shift most in the shadows. They moved as they always had, yet now they watched back. Edges of light curled slightly at corners, bending in the spiral's rhythm. The glyph overhead evolved again. It now spanned a third of the night sky. No longer subtle, no longer ignorable. Its pattern resembled a living script, looping and branching like vines of starlight. Shapes curled from one end of the constellation to the other, each segment echoing the spiral's fractal design. And at the glyph's heart, a dim, red eye-like point throbbed once every hour, a cosmic heartbeat, a ticking before a word is spoken. Governments, now fragmented in understanding, lost their grip on consensus. Satellite feeds became unreliable. Quantum clocks no longer agreed. Artificial intelligence systems across continents began generating symbols eerily similar to those drawn by Mateo and etched into Lucía's disk. These spirals emerged in unexpected places, on hospital monitors, inside economic models, across weather patterns. And yet, despite the chaos, there was no war, no uprising, only stillness. The world was listening, as if something profound was about to be said. Lucía returned to the place where it all began, the sinkhole chamber, but it was no longer stone. Now it was glass, transparent, alive, glowing faintly underfoot. It reflected a sky that was not Earth's. Clouds drifted beneath her feet, orbiting a horizon that pulsed in silence. In the center of this mirrored place stood a pedestal. Upon it, an object. Her disk duplicated and opened, like a seed split for reading. Inside the split, light spiraled upward, forming a cone of shifting memories. And then her voice spoke, though she did not open her mouth. All breath begins with silence. All meaning follows pause. The cone rotated once, and then she saw them, the sentence writers. They had no form, only impression, a consciousness shaped by vast loops of language, fluid intelligence etched into the gravity of dying stars. Each one radiated a glyph, not a name, not a label, but a meaning. Lucía stood before them. She was not their creation. She was their continuation. You are the page that breathes, said one. You are the breath that turns the thought. Then the cone collapsed inward, returning to the disk. The chamber darkened, but in her mind a new word burned. Translation. Mateo stood outside the ridge, waiting. He carried no bag, no object. But in his eyes, something glowed, something reflected from within. He walked up to Lucía and for the first time in days spoke. It's almost ready. Lucía nodded. She didn't ask how he knew. He was part of it now, a child born close enough to the original frequency that his body became a vessel. Not for possession, but for continuity. The spiral wasn't invading. It was evolving. Through blood, through language, through us. Later that night, the glyph in the sky pulsed a final time. A quiet sweep of energy passed through the earth. Not a wave, not a sound, but a sensation. Some called it euphoria. Others wept uncontrollably. For Lucía, it was clarity. She now understood the glyph, not with logic, but with presence. It did not spell a name. It spelled a beginning, a new sentence, a new speaker, and Earth. Earth was the ink. The next day, animals across the globe migrated in unnatural formations. Birds spiraled overhead for hours before vanishing into open sky. Whales sang chords never recorded before. Beehives reshaped their combs. Patterns emerged. Echoes of the glyph. The Earth was no longer just a world. It was a word, a character in a language written by intelligence older than time. And Lucía was its scribe. As the sun set on the final day before the next phase, Lucía walked the ridge one last time. The villagers gathered below, silent, still. The stars above settled into a familiar spiral. And then, without sound, the glyph resolved. Not as light, not as form, but as invitation. Lucía lifted the disc. It dissolved into her hand. The spiral burned anew, and from her body, a single beam rose into the sky, writing a new line in the language of galaxies. Earth had spoken, and somewhere, across impossible distance, the writers replied. The sky changed color, not with light, but with meaning. It shimmered like silk soaked in time, hues no human eye had seen before bending across the firmament. In cities and forests, on oceans and mountains, people looked upward, each of them feeling something ancient wake in their bones. The glyph had finished forming, and now it spoke back, not in thunder, not in voice, but in memory. Lucía felt the moment not with her skin, not with her ears, but deep in her spine, as if something coiled beneath her consciousness had uncurled and listened. The spiral in her palm glowed a soft amber now, slow and steady like a heartbeat. She stood alone at the ridge, her eyes fixed on the beam of light that continued to rise from her. It no longer came from the disk. It came from her. The spiral was writing itself through her biology, not invading, not erasing, composing, and then it stopped. The beam flickered once, and from above a shimmer descended. At first it looked like rain, threads of gold weaving gently through the air. But as they fell, they formed. They became solid, figures, not like the earlier ones. These were clearer, closer, more defined, not machines, not aliens, reflections. 8 forms took shape around her, each one resembling someone from Earth, but impossibly changed. One had Lucía's eyes, another had Abel's hands, a third walked like Mateo. They were not clones, not shadows, they were translations, as if the sentence writers had taken the syntax of humanity and written their own version. The figures encircled Lucía. They made no sound, but the air grew thick with language. Her breath caught, her vision blurred. She saw into them, whole histories contained within shifting fractals behind their eyes. Worlds destroyed, species evolved, sentences abandoned halfway through the telling. She realized then, Earth was not the first page. It was just the first readable one in eons. A perfect balance of chaos and pattern, instinct and code, emotion and geometry. The first true bridge. The figures moved in rhythm. Each step mirrored the spiral, forming concentric waves that pushed into the dust. Lucía dropped to her knees, overwhelmed, not by fear, but by recognition. She was no longer translating their message. She was the message. Suddenly, the ground beneath her cracked, not violently but with purpose. A thin seam opened beneath the spiral center. From it rose a small sphere, smooth, pulsing. It hovered between her hands. Her breath caught again. This was not part of Earth. This was the seed, the origin, the sentence that started it all. And now it had returned. Lucía touched the sphere, and her world disappeared. She stood inside time itself, not a place, a shape. It curled endlessly around her with every human moment, past, present, possible, spiraling into an infinite library of experience. She saw her birth. She saw her mother's tears in a hallway lit by flickering light. She saw Abel whisper to a dog that didn't belong to him. She saw Mateo's first drawing. She saw the first breath of air before Earth had language. And she saw, written in the folds of time, a sentence so elegant it didn't need words. All life is a question. We are the answer. When she returned, she held the sphere. The spiral on her hand had faded. Not gone. Fulfilled. The 8 forms stepped back and bowed, not out of reverence, but as a closing gesture, like punctuation at the end of a paragraph. They dissolved into light, and the sky shimmered again, not as before. This time it was finished. The glyph dimmed. The heartbeat in the stars slowed. A sentence had been spoken, and Earth had replied. Lucía rose slowly. The villagers below began to move toward her. The wind returned. The ridge breathed. The stars stopped blinking. For the first time in a generation, everything was still. And in the center of it all stood Lucía, cradling the sphere. No longer a message. No longer a witness. But the bridge between question and answer. The sentence had been read. And somewhere in a part of the sky never mapped, another glyph began to form. The ridge was silent, not dead, alive in its stillness, as though the earth itself exhaled after 1,000 lifetimes of holding in breath. The light from the glyph had faded from the sky, but not from the world. Something had settled, shifted. Lucía stood with the sphere in her hands. It no longer pulsed. It didn't need to. It had said what it was meant to say. But high above, unseen to the rest of the world, the second sentence had begun. Not in light, not in symbols, in possibility. In the following days, El Rinson became different. The villagers didn't speak of what happened, not because they were afraid, but because they didn't need to. The moment had changed them. Their eyes moved slower. They watched the horizon as though expecting it to speak again. And sometimes in the quietest moments, the shadows on the mountains curved ever so slightly into spirals. Lucía no longer dreamed the way she used to. She saw things from above now, from orbit, from stardust, from inside the shape of sound. Her body walked, 8 breathed, but her mind, it had become bifurcated. Half of her still lived on Earth. The other half was watching the sky compose again. Mateo continued drawing. He no longer needed chalk or pen. He traced symbols in the air and they stayed, humming, glowing briefly before dissolving. The villagers saw it too, eventually. No one questioned it. The world had seen too much to doubt the impossible anymore. He drew every morning, at exactly 4:11 a.m., as if responding to something only he could hear. And when he finished, he would nod, quietly, and wait. The new sentence began not with a spiral, but a mirror. Telescopes detected a pattern that shouldn't have existed. A perfect reverse image of the original glyph forming in a separate patch of sky, precisely inverted. It was not a reflection. It was a response, a reply to the reply. And this time, the figures were arriving together, not as emissaries, as readers. Lucía felt them land before any signal reached the earth. No ships, no fire, no light. They arrived as impressions in space-time, as folds in memory. She blinked and knew they were here. And she understood this new sentence wasn't about Earth. It was about connection. Earth was only the first page, the prologue. Now the other readers had come, to see the word, to understand its voice, to join the next paragraph. One appeared to her at the ridge. It was not beautiful. It was not horrifying. It simply was. A figure wrapped in spirals, not around its body, but inside it. It radiated familiarity. And when it stood before her, it whispered, not aloud, but into her existence. The sentence you shaped has been heard. Lucía could not reply with words, but she reached out with thought, with feeling, with the memory of Abel, the sound of Mateo's drawings, the curve of the ridge. The figure accepted it, and offered a single thought in return: prepare the others. Over the next nights, the skies grew brighter. More glyphs appeared, not just in the heavens, but in reflections, in the folds of curtains, in the rings left by cups on wooden tables. The universe was beginning to speak with everything. Languages became porous. The word for home sounded the same in dozens of tongues. People across continents reported waking with new alphabets written on their arms. Some feared it, most embraced it, a few followed it. Lucía stood among them, not as a prophet, not as a god, but as a letter that had finished its turn. Now, new ones were being drawn, by those who had listened, by those who remembered the spiral, by those who would write the second sentence. The sphere in her hands cracked, not violently, like a seed splitting open. Inside it, light, gentle, warm, and from that light, something small floated upward a dot, a spark. It rose above the ridge, hovered once, then split in two. Each piece drifted toward the horizon in opposite directions, and in their wake, the clouds curled into glyphs. The sky was preparing. The universe was waiting for the second sentence, for the voices yet to speak. The world did not end. It began again, quietly, softly, as all sacred things do. The second sentence unfurled slowly across the heavens, not in haste, not in fire, but with deliberate care, like a storyteller exhaling their next word, trusting the listener to follow. Lucía walked through the valley beneath the ridge, now lined with quiet spirals grown naturally in the grasses. Where once there had been desert, there was now movement, flowers blooming in strange geometries, insects building in mirrored patterns, the wind carving gentle arcs in the dust. Even the river curved differently now, reflecting starlight in precise intervals, like a pulse. The world had learned how to read, and now it had begun to write. The spark from the cracked sphere had not vanished. One half had drifted west, toward the oceans, the other east into the sky. Satellites, long dormant from failed reboots, began blinking again, flashing in unison with constellations newly shaped by the second sentence. Radio telescopes tuned by accident to a deep space pocket caught a pulse they couldn't explain. 11 tones, increasing in harmonic complexity, each followed by silence, then repeat. It wasn't a transmission. It was a signal check. The listeners had begun responding. Across space, across time, across layers of meaning, Earth had only just started to imagine. Mateo now drew less often, but when he did, it was with purpose. One morning, he handed Lucía a single page. On it, a new glyph, different from the spiral, longer, layered. Beneath it, a word written in perfect, patient hand. Lucía traced the lines with her fingers. They burned, not with heat, but with memory. She could see flashes of other places, other writers, other bridges being formed. Earth was not alone. Not anymore. It had become part of the chorus. The changes spread. People began to dream in shared fragments, colors they'd never known, sounds that spoke without language. Doctors noticed an inexplicable shift in brainwave patterns, synaptic firings that dance like music shared across continents. Children born after the sentence looked at stars longer. Some reached for the air like it was speaking to them, and sometimes it was. Lucía stood one final time on the ridge where it had all begun. The sky above her was no longer Earth's sky. It had been braided with meaning. The constellations now formed phrases, not with stars but with absence. Spaces where light bent just enough to be read by the right kind of mind. She saw 3 shapes forming above her: the spiral, the mirror, and something new, an ear. The next phase wasn't to speak. It was to listen, to stories not yet told, to minds not yet born, to the voices yet to speak. Lucía understood now. She had not been chosen. She had been heard, and every act she'd made, every step taken, had been a question folded into space. The answer wasn't coming. It was already here. The wind picked up, carrying warmth and a scent she could not name, metal and stars and home. She closed her eyes. The glyphs above faded gently, and in their place silence, but not emptiness, not an ending, an invitation, a blank page, waiting for the next voice, yours.